The cool Montana dusk settled over Whispering Creek Valley, casting long shadows across Emma Hawthorne's ruined wheat fields. Her father's old Winchester rifle felt heavy in her trembling hands as she surveyed the devastation. At 45, she had already weathered more storms than most, first losing her husband to typhoid, and now this. But what the outlaws who destroyed her harvest didn't know, what no one in Whispering Creek knew, was that Emma Hawthorne had been born Emma Blackwood, daughter of the most lethal marksman ever to ride the Montana Territory. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Whispering Creek Valley stretched beneath the towering Bitterroot Mountains, the vast expanse of wheat fields shimmering gold in the late summer sun. At first glance, Emma Hawthorne's homestead looked like any other struggling farm, a weather-beaten two-story house, a sturdy red barn, and endless rows of wheat reaching toward the distant peaks. But Emma had built something extraordinary. Here, transforming her late husband's modest farm into the region's most successful grain operation through determination and an uncanny talent for cultivation. Her success hadn't gone unnoticed. The Rattler Gang, led by the notorious Silas Kane, had been systematically targeting farms throughout the valley. Their tactics grew bolder with each raid, first cattle rustling, then mysterious fires, and finally outright destruction of crops and property. Any farmer who refused to pay their protection fees found themselves facing increasingly violent consequences. Emma wiped sweat from her brow as she checked the irrigation channels between her wheat rows. Her practical work dress couldn't hide the graceful way she moved, a legacy of her father's training. To her neighbors, she was simply John Hawthorne's widow, the stubborn woman who refused to be intimidated by outlaws. What none of them knew was that her success wasn't just about farming skill or determination. The Blackwood family had once controlled every major trading route from Helena to the Canadian border, not through violence alone, but through unparalleled marksmanship and strategic brilliance. Emma's father, William Deadeye Blackwood, hadn't just been the territory's deadliest shot. He'd been a master tactician who understood that true power came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Mrs. Hawthorne, young Daniel Cooper, their teenage ranch hand, came running from the direction of the main road. "Riders coming! 6 of them, led by that Kane fellow himself." Emma straightened, unconsciously falling into the shooter's stance. Her father had drilled into her since childhood. Get Martha and help her secure the house, then find Robert and tell him to watch the back property line. The surge. As Daniel rushed to comply, Emma felt something stirring in her blood, an awareness she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Silas Kane emerged from the evening haze, his black duster and silver-trimmed hat marking him as someone who preferred style over practicality. 5 hard-looking men flanked him, their gun belts riding low in the manner of professional killers. Emma recognized their type immediately, though she pretended not to notice how they spread out to surround her position. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Kane called out, his tone mockingly cordial, despite the threat implicit in his men's positioning. "Beautiful evening for farming, though it must be difficult managing such a large operation on your own, Mr. Kane." Emma kept her voice neutral, though her fingers itched for the Winchester hidden in the barn. "I wasn't expecting another visit so soon. My answer hasn't changed since last week." Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The situation has changed, Mom. We've discovered some irregularities in your property taxes. It seems your late husband might have left you in a precarious position." Emma felt a familiar coldness settle over her, a clarity of thought she hadn't experienced since she'd left her father's house. Kane was lying. She knew every detail of her farm's legal status, because she understood something he didn't. The Blackwoods hadn't maintained their power through gunfighting alone. They'd been masters of territorial law, experts at using their enemies' assumptions against them. My taxes are perfectly current, Mr. Kane, though I'm sure the territorial marshal would be interested in examining your gang's recent activities just as carefully. One of Kane's men, a scarred individual with dead eyes, shifted his hand closer to his gun. Emma noticed the movement without seeming to, her mind automatically cataloguing angles and distances just as she'd been taught. They weren't here for negotiation. The timing was wrong, and their positioning spoke of violence to come. That's the problem with women trying to run businesses, Kane sighed, dropping all pretense of courtesy. They don't understand how things really work. We're taking control of every farm in this valley one way or another. The smart folks have already paid for our protection. The stubborn ones, he gestured at his armed companions. Well, accidents happen. Emma met his gaze steadily, showing nothing of the tactical calculations running through her mind. These men were used to intimidating ordinary farmers. They had no idea they were threatening someone who'd learned strategy and marksmanship from the man who'd once outshot Wild Bill Hickok himself. You have until sundown tomorrow to reconsider our offer, Kane announced, already turning his horse. After that, we can't be responsible for any unfortunate events that might occur. As they rode away, Emma remained outwardly calm, while her mind raced with plans. She'd spent 15 years building a new life, trying to escape her father's violent legacy. But as she watched dust devils dance across her threatened wheat fields, she knew the time for hiding was over. "Daniel," she called to the young ranch hand who'd reappeared at her side, "ride into town. Tell Marshal Wilson I'd like to discuss some concerns about recent criminal activity in the valley." She paused, then added, "And stop by the telegraph office. Send a message to W. Blackwood in Fort Benton. Just 3 words. Emma needs you." The boy rushed to comply, not understanding the significance of the message he carried. Emma watched him go, feeling the weight of her father's teachings settling back onto her shoulders. She'd chosen peace for 15 years, but she was still her father's daughter. Kane and his men had no idea they weren't just threatening a widow's farm. They were awakening something that had been sleeping in the Montana wilderness for 2 decades. Behind her weathered farmhouse, hidden beneath innocent-looking hay bales, lay her father's old gun chest. Inside rested not just weapons, but detailed maps of every trading route and strategic position in 3 territories. The Blackwood family hadn't maintained their power through marksmanship alone. They'd controlled the very lifeblood of frontier commerce itself. Emma Hawthorne stood watching the sunset paint, Whispering Creek Valley in deepening shadows, knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything would change. The quiet farmer's widow was about to remind the territory why the name Blackwood had once made even the most hardened outlaws think twice about causing trouble in Montana. Emma strode to her farmhouse porch, each step measured and deliberate. The evening brought a coolness that belied the heat building in her chest. Through the kitchen window, she could see Martha, her housekeeper of 8 years, pretending to work while stealing worried glances at the yard where Kane's men had stood. The farmhouse held secrets that even Martha didn't know about. Behind the root cellar's false wall, a hidden room housed more than just her father's weapons cache. There were ledgers documenting cattle drives dating back 20 years, carefully preserved letters revealing corrupt deals between outlaw gangs and territorial officials, and most importantly, her father's personal journal detailing every strategic position in Whispering Creek Valley. Mrs. Hawthorne, Robert, her foreman, approached from the barn. A veteran of the range wars further north, he had an uncanny sense for trouble. "Those men, they're not just common bandits. I recognized one of them, Jake Murphy. He rode with the younger gang before they were captured. He's a killer." Emma nodded, unsurprised. "Kane's getting desperate. The Rattler gang's losing territory up north. They need new hunting grounds." She caught herself too late, seeing Robert's questioning look at her knowledge of outlaw gang movements, but her foreman was too diplomatic to question her slip. Instead, he said, "Daniel's back from town. Marshal Wilson wasn't in his office. His deputy said he's been meeting with some of Kane's men all week." Of course he had. Emma remembered her father's teachings about corruption, how it spread like poison in a well, contaminating everything it touched. The Rattler gang wouldn't have moved this aggressively without ensuring local law enforcement would look the other way. Emma waited until Robert had returned to his duties before entering the house. In her bedroom, she knelt beside the cedar chest. Her mother had given her the one possession she'd brought from her old life. Inside, beneath carefully folded linens, lay a false bottom concealing a single photograph. It showed a younger version of herself standing beside a tall man with steel-grey eyes and a Springfield rifle worn with the ease of a second skin. William Deadeye Blackwood hadn't just been the fastest shot in the territories. He'd been a master strategist who understood that true power came from controlling key positions, not just winning gunfights. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Through the bedroom window, she spotted 3 riders approaching from the south, ranch hands from the Peterson place, if she wasn't mistaken. Old man Peterson had sold his cattle to Kane last month after his prized bulls mysteriously disappeared. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" Daniel's voice carried urgency. "The Peterson boys are here. They say they got a message for you." Emma tucked the photograph away and moved to the porch, noting how Peterson's youngest son, Billy, kept his hand near his gun. They'd been good neighbors once, before Kane's influence turned them. "Evening, Mrs. Hawthorne," Jack Peterson, the eldest, called out. "Just passing along a friendly reminder about Mr. Kane's offer. Be a shame if anything happened to this fine crop of yours." Emma's response was cut short by the distant sound of galloping hooves, a single rider approaching fast from the direction of town. The Petersons turned to look, and Emma saw their faces pale. The rider emerged from the evening haze, a tall figure on a dark horse moving with the fluid grace that marked a true horseman. Even at a distance, Emma recognized the distinctive, brass-trimmed Springfield rifle at the stranger's back. The Petersons didn't wait to make introductions, spurring their horses into a hasty retreat. They'd never met William Blackwood, but every outlaw in the territory knew the description of his signature weapon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rider reined up at her gate, and Emma felt 15 years of carefully constructed identity begin to crack. Her father's face had aged, but his eyes were the same, sharp as a hawk's and twice as deadly. "Hello, little Endove," William Blackwood said softly, using her childhood nickname. "Seems like it's time for some family business." The sun slipped behind the bitter roots, casting long shadows across Whispering Creek Valley. Emma Blackwood, felt the weight of legacy settling onto her shoulders. By sending that telegram, she'd done more than just call for help. She'd awakened something that had been sleeping in the Montana wilderness. Something Kane's outlaws weren't prepared to face. Tomorrow would bring violence. There was no avoiding that now. But it wouldn't be the simple kind of violence Kane's men understood. The Blackwoods hadn't maintained their power through force alone. They'd been masters of strategy, experts at using their enemies' assumptions against them. As night fell over Whispering Creek Valley, Emma led her father into the house, already feeling tactical options unfolding in her mind. Kane and his men thought they were dealing with a helpless widow. They were about to learn that some legends don't die, they just wait for the right moment to return. The cool Montana air carried the scent of pine and sage as William Blackwood studied the valley through his brass spyglass, noting every detail of the terrain with a marksman's precision. From his vantage point on the farmhouse's hidden observation platform, a clever addition Emma had built into the attic years ago, He could see the entire spread of Whispering Creek Valley laid out before him. Kane's men are already setting up, he observed, tracking the movement of riders along the distant ridgelines. 3 groups, main force at the north end of your wheat fields, smaller units covering the access roads. Emma unrolled a yellowed map on the platform's small table. The document showed more than just Whispering Creek Valley's visible features. It revealed an intricate network of hidden trails and concealed positions that her father had mapped decades ago. "The Rattler gang's getting cocky," she explained, pointing to recent tracks near the valley's northern edge. "They've been using the old smugglers' trails, but they don't understand the full system. Control these 3 positions," her finger traced specific locations, "and you control every approach to the farm." William nodded approvingly. "You've kept up with your studies. Good. Now, about these men Kane hired. Jake Murphy's their tactical leader?" "Confirmed. Run-ins with the law in Dakota and Wyoming. He's got a reputation for being methodical. Thorough and predictable," William added. "I crossed paths with him in '82. He always secures high ground first, places his best shots where they can cover the most territory." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, just like he's doing now. "On that ridge above your north field," Emma felt old instincts awakening as she studied the enemy positions. Her father had trained her to think 3 moves ahead, to see patterns in enemy behavior that revealed their plans and their weaknesses. "They're expecting resistance," she mused, "but they're looking in the wrong places. All their preparations assume we'll fight to protect the wheat fields directly." A knock at the trapdoor interrupted their planning. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Robert's voice carried urgency. "Riders coming in from town. Looks like Marshal Wilson himself this time." Emma and William exchanged knowing looks. The Rattler gang wouldn't waste time now that they'd shown their hand. The Marshal's arrival meant the next phase was beginning. "Stay up here," Emma told her father. "Let's not show all our cards yet." She descended to find Marshal Wilson already dismounting in her yard, 6 deputies spreading out behind him. The Marshal's usually genial face was set in grim lines. "Emma," he began, not bothering with pleasantries, "got some disturbing reports. Kane's men claim you've been threatening their legitimate business interests. They've got complaints filed at the territorial office." He shifted uncomfortably. "I need to take a look around your property, check for any stolen cattle brands they're claiming you've altered." Emma noted how his deputies positioned themselves, not to protect her property, but to contain any resistance. The Rattler gang's influence ran deep. "Of course, Marshal," she replied calmly. "I keep all my documentation in order, though I'm curious about one thing." She met his eyes steadily. "Did Mr. Kane mention how many armed men he's moved onto my property boundaries this morning? Or why Jake Murphy, a known killer, is commanding them?" Wilson's face reddened. "Now, Emma, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The Rattler gang has legitimate security concerns." "Indeed they do." The new voice carried absolute authority. William Blackwood emerged from the farmhouse, his brass-trimmed Springfield gleaming in the morning sun. "Marshal Wilson, been a long time." The change in the law officer's demeanor was immediate. His face went pale, and his hand froze halfway to his gun. "Blackwood, but you're dead." "The papers say a lot of things," William replied mildly. "Like those complaints claiming my daughter's threatening honest businessmen. Interesting timing on those, wouldn't you say?" The deputies looked uncertain, several backing away slightly. William Blackwood's reputation wasn't just about his deadly accuracy with a rifle. It was his tactical brilliance that had made him truly dangerous. "This is still official business," Wilson managed, though his voice had lost its authority. "Kane has legal complaints that need to be properly reviewed by the territorial court." "That can be properly reviewed," Emma interrupted smoothly, "along with evidence of certain financial arrangements between the Rattler gang and local law enforcement." Wilson's face went from pale to ashen. William Blackwood's reputation for gathering damaging information had been as feared as his marksmanship. "I'll need to consult with the territorial office," the marshal said stiffly. "Make sure all the paperwork is in order." Emma watched them retreat, noting how quickly the deputies abandoned their threatening positions. But this was just the opening move in a larger game. "Kane won't take this lying down," she observed as the lawman vanished into the morning haze. "He's invested too much." William was already scanning the ridgelines through his spyglass again. "No, he won't. Murphy's shifting his men, tightening their positions." He lowered the glass, his expression thoughtful. "But he's still thinking like a common outlaw, preparing for a direct confrontation. While we're going to show him something completely different," Emma finished, her mind already working through the strategy they'd developed during the night. The sun climbed higher over Whispering Creek Valley as father and daughter refined their plans. The Rattler gang had numbers, weapons, and corrupt officials on their side, but the Blackwoods had something more valuable: generations of knowledge about the land itself, and the tactical brilliance to use that knowledge in ways their enemies couldn't imagine. Emma checked her father's old Winchester, now riding at her hip. The familiar weight reminded her of long-ago lessons in strategy and survival. High on the ridge, Jake Murphy watched the farm through his own spyglass. The appearance of William Blackwood complicated things, but Murphy had faced legends before. "Burn it." Kane's orders came through clear and cold. "Burn every last stalk of wheat. Show them what happens when people defy the Rattler gang." Murphy gave his signals, and mounted men began moving into position. They were executing a textbook operation to surround the farm, but they were about to encounter a very different kind of response. In the pre-dawn darkness, Emma and William had prepared carefully. Daniel and Robert had helped them position supplies at key points throughout the property, following a strategy that would have seemed bizarre to anyone who didn't understand the Blackwoods' way of thinking. "First group's moving," William observed from their hidden position in the converted windmill tower. Murphy's men were advancing on the northern wheat field, carrying torches and kerosene. "Right where we want them." Emma touched a small lever, disguised as part of the windmill's mechanism. Hidden channels they'd prepared during the night released collected water from the irrigation system, turning seemingly solid ground into treacherous mud. The first riders went down hard, their horses foundering in the suddenly soft earth. "Signal Robert," Emma instructed Daniel. The young ranch hand triggered a series of lantern flashes from the barn's cupola. Across the valley, previously invisible allies began moving into position. Farmers and ranchers who'd suffered under Kane's predations, now working together under the Blackwoods' guidance. Murphy spotted the movement too late. "It's a trap," he shouted, but his men were already scattered, their formation broken by the treacherous ground. From concealed positions, Emma's allies began picking off the outlaws' horses with carefully placed shots, not killing, but driving the animals into panic. William Blackwood hadn't fired a single shot yet. He didn't need to. His reputation alone was causing Kane's men to see threats in every shadow, making them waste ammunition on imagined movements. "Watch the south fence line," Emma warned, spotting a second group trying to flank their position. But this, too, had been anticipated. Martha and several other women from neighboring farms had spent the night spreading coal oil in strategic lines, invisible until lit. At Emma's signal, they touched off the barriers, creating walls of flame that channeled the outlaws' movement. Exactly where the Blackwoods wanted them. Kane himself arrived as the chaos unfolded, his face darkening with rage. "Kill them all!" he ordered, abandoning any pretense of legitimate business. "Burn everything!" But his men were already losing cohesion, their careful plan disintegrating in the face of opposition they couldn't effectively fight. Every time they tried to concentrate their forces, hidden defenders would pick off key positions, forcing them to scatter again. "Murphy," Kane shouted, "get your sharpshooters on that windmill." Too late. Emma's allies had already occupied the high ground positions that Murphy's men had scouted the day before, using the Blackwood's knowledge of hidden trails to reach them unseen. Now those same positions were being used to rain precise fire onto the Outlaws' fallback routes. William watched the disintegration of Kane's attack with professional interest. Murphy's losing control of his men. See how they're bunching up? Rookies always do that under pressure. Emma had already spotted something more concerning. Kane's brought dynamite. Looks like he's planning to destroy what he can't steal. Ghost of a smile touched William's weathered face. Desperate men make predictable choices. He turned to Daniel. Signal the second phase. Across the valley, more of Emma's allies emerged from hiding. These weren't just farmers with rifles. They were veterans of frontier conflicts, men who understood tactical movement. They began systematically cutting off Kane's escape routes, using the same terrain features that Murphy had planned to exploit. Impossible, Kane's voice carried across the chaos. How many shooters do you have? Enough, William's response projected calm authority. More than enough to make sure the Rattler gang never threatens another farm. Kane's response was to light the first stick of dynamite himself, hurling it toward the nearest wheat field. But Emma had anticipated this too. Hidden defenders targeted the explosive in midair, their precise shots sending it spinning harmlessly into a prepared drainage ditch. Your father taught you well, Robert observed, rejoining them in the windmill tower. Kane's men are starting to turn on each other. Murphy's trying to organize a retreat, but half his shooters won't follow orders anymore. This was the true power of the Blackwood strategy. Not just outfighting their enemies, but making those enemies defeat themselves through confusion and fear. Every move Kane made simply entangled him further in the web of tactical preparations. Emma and William had laid. Hold your positions, Emma instructed through their signal system. Let them see the trap closing. Kane's men were now caught in a deadly predicament. Every time they tried to advance, hidden defenders would pick them off. When they attempted to retreat, they found their escape routes blocked. The few shots they managed to fire at the windmill sparked harmlessly off steel plates Emma had installed years ago, disguised as ordinary repairs. Your next move is crucial, William told his daughter, watching Kane become increasingly erratic. He's got one card left to play. Emma nodded, already seeing the pattern. Kane was gathering his remaining loyal men around him, preparing for one desperate charge. He thought he could overwhelm the farm's defenses through sheer force, not understanding that this too had been anticipated. Now, she commanded softly, Robert triggered the final trap. The irrigation channels they'd modified during the night suddenly released their full pressure, turning the battlefield into a maze of water-filled ditches. Horses panicked, riders were unseated, and Kane's last-ditch attack dissolved into chaos. Murphy's running, Daniel reported, watching through his own spyglass. The feared tactician had finally recognized the futility of their position, abandoning Kane to save himself. But Kane wasn't finished. In his desperation, he turned his guns on his own men, trying to force them to continue the attack. This final act of brutality broke what remained of his authority. His remaining followers turned on him, and the battle devolved into a chaotic free-for-all among the outlaws themselves. William raised his Springfield rifle for the first time since the confrontation began. One shot rang out, precise and devastating. Kane's gun went spinning from his hand, the bullet having struck it perfectly to disarm without killing. That's what a real marksman can do, William commented mildly, when he chooses to. The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating a changed Whispering Creek Valley. Kane's carefully planned operation lay in ruins, his men scattered or surrendered. But more importantly, the true nature of the Blackwood family's power had been revealed, not just their skill with weapons, but their deep understanding of how to turn an enemy's strength against them. Through her spyglass, Emma could see more. Riders approaching, honest farmers and ranchers drawn by the sound of gunfire, coming to stand with their neighbors against the outlaws. Kane's attempt to destroy her farm had instead awakened something he couldn't control, the community's will to resist. "Your reputation for shooting was always just a tool," Emma said to her father as they watched Kane being taken into custody. "The real power was in making enemies defeat themselves." William nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Strategy over force, planning over violence. You remembered the most important lessons." He studied the gathering crowd of neighbors. Kane thought he was just fighting two people. He never understood he was challenging an entire way of thinking. The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman had demonstrated why their family name had once commanded such respect throughout the territories, not through violence alone, but through the wisdom to understand that true victory comes from the mind rather than the trigger finger. The aftermath of the battle brought new challenges. Through her network of allies, Emma learned that Kane's defeat had sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Other outlaw gangs were watching Whispering Creek Valley, reassessing their own plans for expansion. The Blackwood's victory had disrupted more than just the Rattler gang's operations. It had challenged the very foundations of how power worked in the territory. "They'll come looking for revenge," Robert warned, helping to secure the captured outlaws. "Men like Kane have friends in dark places." Emma was already analyzing patterns in the intelligence her allies brought. 3 other gangs had been waiting to see if Kane succeeded, ready to move into their own targeted territories. His defeat had forced them to recalculate, but that made them more dangerous, not less. William studied his daughter's tactical assessments with approval. "You've built something stronger than just a successful farm here. You've created a network of mutual protection." Indeed, as the day progressed, more supporters arrived at the Hawthorne farm. Not just neighbors anymore, but representatives from other communities that had suffered under outlaw depredations. They'd heard about how a widow and her legendary father had defeated the infamous Rattler gang, but what they found was something more valuable. A blueprint for how ordinary people could protect themselves against organized criminal power. "Marshal Wilson's resigned," Daniel reported, returning from town. "Seems he got word that certain documents about his dealings with Kane were about to become public." Emma nodded, unsurprised. The morning's victory hadn't just been about defending wheat fields. It had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape power throughout the territory. The corrupt officials who had enabled Kane's operations were already scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. "But there's something else," Daniel continued, his young face serious. Before he left, Wilson was meeting with some fancy-dressed fellows from back east, looked like Pinkerton men. This development caught William's attention. "Kane's defeat is drawing exactly the kind of attention we expected. The real battle's just beginning." Emma studied the valley through her spyglass, noting how her allies had naturally organized themselves into an effective defense network. Kane had thought he was just fighting for control of one farm. Instead, he'd awakened something far more powerful, a community's realization that they didn't have to submit to criminal authority. "Let them come," she said quietly, watching the sun set behind the bitterroots. "We've shown people what's possible when they stand together. That's a lesson that can't be undone." The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman had transformed their victory over Kane's gang into something larger. A demonstration that true power didn't flow from the barrel of a gun, but from the unbreakable bonds between people who refused to be victimized. The real battle for Whispering Creek Valley was just beginning, and it would be fought with weapons that no outlaw gang, no matter how ruthless, could easily counter. The dawn light crept across Whispering Creek Valley, revealing William Blackwood studying the approaches to the farm through his brass spyglass. His weathered face showed no emotion as he tracked the movements of riders along distant trails. Two groups moving parallel to Thunder Ridge, he noted, recognizing patterns in seemingly random travel. Pinkerton men, trying not to look like Pinkerton men. Emma joined her father on the windmill platform, her own tactical assessment already forming. The agency's involvement meant the conflict was escalating beyond local boundaries. They're not just investigating Kane's defeat, they're mapping our defensive positions. From their elevated vantage point, they could see how the valley had transformed in the days since the battle. Local farmers had organized themselves into patrol groups, using the techniques Emma and William had taught them. What had started as a desperate defense of one farm was evolving into something more systematic. Samuel Chen's group spotted 3 strangers near his place last night, Daniel reported, climbing up to join them. The young ranch hand had grown more confident since the fight, showing a natural talent for gathering intelligence. They were asking questions about the battle, especially about our shooting positions. Emma unrolled a new map on the platform's small table. Unlike the tactical surveys they'd used against Kane, this document showed a broader view: trading routes, supply lines, and centers of power throughout the territory. The Pinkertons wouldn't be here unless someone with money sent them. Kane was working for somebody bigger. William nodded grimly. Railroad interests, most likely. They've been trying to control grain shipments throughout the territory. Kane's operation was just one piece of a larger plan. Through their network of allies, they learned that the Pinkerton investigation was unusually thorough. The agents weren't just gathering facts about the battle, they were documenting every aspect of the valley's defensive organization. "Look at their movement pattern," Emma observed, marking positions on the map. "They're not just watching us. They're identifying every farmer who helped us, every family that's part of our mutual protection network." William studied the markings with professional interest. "Smart. They're trying to understand how we turned ordinary farmers into an effective fighting force so quickly." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, "But they're looking for the wrong kind of strength." Emma's mind was already working through implications and counter-strategies. The Pinkertons' presence meant powerful interests were worried, not just about one defeated gang, but about communities learning to defend themselves without corporate or government protection. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Martha's voice carried urgency from below. "Riders coming in. Looks like the territorial marshal himself, with some fancy-dressed gentleman." Emma and William exchanged knowing looks. The next phase was beginning sooner than expected. "Stay up here," Emma told her father. "Let them see the widow first." She descended to find Marshal Thomas Hayes, newly appointed after Wilson's resignation, dismounting in her yard. 3 well-dressed men flanked him, their Eastern suits and careful manner marking them as something more dangerous than mere lawmen. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Hayes began, his tone professionally neutral, "these gentlemen represent certain financial interests concerned about recent events in Whispering Creek Valley." Emma noted how the men positioned themselves, not threatening but calculating every angle of approach. Their eyes missed nothing, assessing her farmhouse's defensive improvements with professional interest. Alexander Pierce, the eldest of the Eastern men, introduced himself, his cultured accent marking him as Boston-educated. "We represent parties interested in ensuring stable grain shipments through this territory. The recent unpleasantness with Mr. Kane has disrupted established business arrangements." Emma kept her expression neutral, though her mind was already cataloguing tactical implications. Kane's business arrangements involved threatening honest farmers and stealing their crops. "I wasn't aware such activities had corporate backing." Pierce's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You misunderstand, Mrs. Hawthorne. We're here to propose a solution that benefits everyone. Your defensive organization has proven quite effective. Perhaps we could discuss incorporating it into a more official security framework." The offer was smooth, reasonable sounding, and absolutely deadly to everything they'd built. Emma recognized the strategy instantly. They were trying to co-opt the valley's defensive network, transform it from community protection into corporate enforcement. An interesting proposal, she replied carefully. Though I'm curious why railroad interests would send Pinkerton agents to investigate a simple farmer's self-defense measures. Pierce's expression flickered slightly, the first crack in his professional facade. William had taught her long ago that revealing your enemy's hidden movements often unsettled them more than direct confrontation. You seem well informed, Mrs. Hawthorne, Pierce recovered smoothly. Perhaps better informed than a simple farmer's widow should be. Your recent victory over Kane's gang showed remarkable tactical sophistication, almost as if you had prior experience with strategic planning. Emma met his probing gaze steadily. We farmers know more than city folk think, Mr. Pierce, about crops, about self-defense, and about the difference between protection and control. The implied threat in his next words was subtle but clear. The railroad is going to secure its grain shipments one way or another, Mrs. Hawthorne. We'd prefer to work with local communities, but we're prepared to implement other solutions. Solutions that might make Mr. Kane's methods look quite gentle. In comparison, like the solutions you implemented in the Dakota Territory. William's voice carried from the farmhouse door, causing all three Eastern men to turn sharply. I heard about how your official security framework worked there. Turned neighbor against neighbor, destroyed communities that had survived everything, else the frontier could throw at them. Pierce's hand moved instinctively toward his coat, but he froze at the sight of William's Springfield rifle. Not aimed, just present, held with the casual competence that marked a true master of the weapon. Blackwood, Pierce breathed, recognition dawning. The reports said you were dead. Reports say a lot of things, William replied mildly, like reports about unstable grain shipments being used to justify corporate takeovers of independent farms. Interesting how similar those reports sound to ones I investigated 15 years ago. Emma watched the tactical dynamics shift. Pierce and his companions had come prepared to pressure a widow into submission. Finding themselves facing William Blackwood changed the equation dramatically, but not in the way they expected. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Blackwood. Pierce recovered his composure, which makes this situation even more interesting. A legendary marksman and his equally talented daughter organizing farmers into an effective defensive force. One might wonder what other skills you've passed on, what other purposes such an organization might serve. Emma recognized the implied threat. They were trying to paint the Valley's mutual protection network as something sinister, laying groundwork for more aggressive intervention. Wonder all you like, she replied calmly. While you're wondering, consider this. Kane thought he was fighting one farm. He discovered he was fighting an entire community, a community that's learned how to protect itself against threats of all kinds. Communities can be broken, Mrs. Hawthorne. Pierce's cultured voice had gone cold, especially when they stand in the way of progress. Can they? William's question carried genuine curiosity. Tell me, Mr. Pierce, how many Pinkerton agents have your employers lost track of in the past week? Pierce's face showed the first real concern. 3 of their agents had indeed vanished while scouting the valley's outer regions. They'd assumed the men had deserted or met with accidents. Your investigators have been quite thorough, Emma noted, documenting our defensive positions, mapping our patrol routes. Did it occur to you that we might be equally thorough in studying your operations? She withdrew a leather portfolio from her desk, removing several detailed documents. These reports make interesting reading, especially the parts about your Dakota Territory operations. The names of officials bribed, the families pressured into selling, the accidents arranged for those who refused. Pierce's composed demeanor cracked further. Where did you get these? The Blackwood family has always understood that information is power, Emma explained calmly. While your agents were mapping our defenses, our allies were uncovering your true plans, Like this report about the grain quality inspections you're planning to use as an excuse for seizing independent farms. Marshal Hayes studied the documents with growing concern. These allegations are serious, Mr. Pierce. If even half of them are true, the railroad brings progress, Marshal. Pierce's voice had turned sharp. Progress requires sacrifices. Surely you understand that maintaining order sometimes requires unconventional methods. Like hiring outlaw gangs to terrorize farmers, William asked mildly. Interesting definition of progress. Emma spread more documents on her desk. Your Dakota Territory operations failed because you didn't understand how communities really work. You thought fear and money could break any resistance, but you created something worse than resistance. You created unity. Through their network, Emma and William had learned that Pierce's railroad interests had been systematically taking control of grain shipping throughout the territories. They used a combination of legal pressure, economic manipulation, and, when necessary, outright violence through hired guns like Kane. Your agents aren't missing, Emma continued. They're being hosted by families throughout the valley, learning firsthand how our community protects itself. Unlike your corporate operations, we believe in transparency. As if on cue, Daniel appeared with 3 trail-worn men, the supposedly missing Pinkerton agents. But instead of looking angry or coerced, they appeared thoughtful. Mr. Pierce, the senior agent, stepped forward. We need to discuss our contract, particularly the parts about maintaining shipping security that turn out to mean destroying legitimate farming operations. Pierce's carefully constructed plan was unraveling. He had expected to find a disorganized group of farmers he could intimidate or co-opt. Instead, he discovered a community that had learned to defend itself not just with guns, but with intelligence and unity. This isn't over, he warned, his cultured accent slipping to reveal something harder beneath. The railroad doesn't accept defeat. No one's defeating the railroad, Emma corrected him. We're simply showing there's a better way to do business, one that doesn't require breaking communities to control them. As Pierce and his companions rode away, Marshal Hayes lingered. The lawman looked troubled, struggling with implications of what he'd learned. The territory's changing, Emma told him quietly. The old methods of corporate control, bribes, threats, hired guns, they don't work when communities learn to stand together. William watched the departing riders through his spyglass. Pierce will be back. Men like him don't give up power easily, but he'll find something different next time, not just armed farmers, but organized communities that understand their true strength. The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman had revealed another layer of their strategy. While Pierce's agents had been looking for military-style defenses, the real power in Whispering Creek Valley lay in the connections between neighbors, the shared determination to protect their way of life. The sun climbed higher, painting the wheat fields in shades of gold. Emma's crop would survive to harvest, but she'd grown something far more valuable. The seeds of resistance against corporate control planted in the hearts of ordinary people who had discovered their collective strength. They'll send others, William observed, studying the horizon. More agents, different strategies, but always with the same goal: control. Emma nodded, already thinking ahead to the next phase of their defense. Let them come. They'll find the same thing Kane did. You can't break a community that's learned to protect itself. The real battle for Whispering Creek Valley was evolving into something larger than defending one farm's crops. It had become a test case for how ordinary people could stand against powerful interests when they understood their true strength. Lay not in weapons or money, but in the unbreakable bonds of community. The Montana evening painted Whispering Creek Valley in deepening purple shadows as Emma tracked movement along the distant ridgelines. Through her spyglass, she counted 12 Riders approaching from different directions, their movements too coordinated to be casual travelers. "Pierce isn't wasting time," William observed from his position at the modified windmill's apex. "Those aren't Pinkertons this time. Look at how they move. Military training." Emma had already spotted the telltale signs. Former cavalry by their formation. Pierce is escalating, bringing in professionals instead of hired guns. Through their network of allies, they'd learned that Pierce had been busy in the week since his visit. He'd recruited a special group of mercenaries, veterans of frontier conflicts who specialized in breaking local resistance to railroad expansion. Marcus. "Fletcher's leading them," Robert reported, climbing up to join them. The foreman had just returned from town with fresh intelligence. He made his reputation in Wyoming, breaking up farmer cooperatives that tried opposing the railroad's land grabs. Emma studied the approaching riders with renewed interest. Fletcher's reputation was well known in certain circles. A former Army captain who turned his military experience to corporate use. Unlike Kane's brutal but predictable tactics, Fletcher employed sophisticated strategies that had proven devastatingly effective. "He's not positioning for an attack," William noted, tracking the riders' movements. "See how they're establishing observation posts? Fletcher's doing it right, gathering intelligence before making any moves." Emma had already recognized the pattern. "He's mapping more than just our defenses. Look at their positions. They're documenting every trail, every supply route, every connection between farms in the valley." Daniel burst in from below, his young face urgent. "Mrs. Hawthorne, telegraph lines to Helena are down, and Fletcher's men have been seen watching the mail coach routes." This was Fletcher's signature opening move, isolating his targets before applying pressure. But Emma and William had anticipated this strategy, having studied reports of his previous operations in Wyoming. "Signal the Chen family," Emma instructed Daniel. "Tell them to activate the alternate communication network." In the days following Pierce's visit, they'd established a sophisticated system of runners and signal stations using the valley's terrain to bypass conventional communication routes. Fletcher might control the telegraph lines, but he couldn't stop the flow of information through channels he didn't know existed. "Fletcher's smart," William mused, watching the mercenaries' methodical movements. "He knows he's not just fighting farmers with rifles. He's looking for the organization behind our defense network." Through their carefully placed observers, they learned that Fletcher had already begun the next phase of his operation. His men were visiting farms throughout the valley, not with threats, but with carefully crafted offers of protection and partnership with the railroad's interests. "He's trying to divide us," Emma explained to the gathered farm representatives in her barn that evening. "Turn neighbor against neighbor before moving against any single target." Samuel Chen, whose family had farmed the valley's eastern section for 2 generations, stood up. "Fletcher's men visited today, offer to buy our entire crop at double market price if we agree to ship exclusively through their rail line." Similar reports came from other farmers. Fletcher was identifying key properties, testing for weak points in the valley's unity, but he'd miscalculated in a crucial way. "He's using the same strategy that failed in Dakota Territory," William told them, spreading out a map marked with Fletcher's troop movements, trying to create dependency before showing his real intentions. Emma had already spotted the flaw in Fletcher's approach. "He thinks we're just a temporary alliance of convenience. He doesn't understand what we've really built here." Through their network, they received word that Fletcher had established his headquarters in the abandoned Silver Creek mine office. Unlike Kane's crude operation, this was a sophisticated command center, complete with detailed maps and communication equipment. "He's planning something big," Robert reported, returning from scouting the mine. "Supply wagons arriving daily, men drilling in military formations. This isn't just about controlling grain shipments anymore." Emma studied the latest intelligence with growing concern. Fletcher's men weren't just watching farms, they were documenting every aspect of valley life. Who traded with whom, which families were connected by marriage or friendship, where loyalties might be tested. "Signal Martha's group," she instructed Daniel. "Tell them to accelerate the harvest preparations. We need to be ready before Fletcher makes his move." William watched his daughter's tactical mind at work with quiet pride. She wasn't just thinking about defending individual farms anymore. She was seeing the larger patterns, the web of relationships that gave their community its true strength. A rider approached at speed through the gathering dusk. Young Thomas Chen, Samuel's son. "Fletcher's men are spreading news in town," he reported breathlessly. "Claims they've found proof that the Blackwoods were behind Kane's operation all along, that this whole thing was staged to take control of the valley's shipping routes." This was another of Fletcher's tactics, attacking the credibility of community leaders, sowing doubt before moving against their physical resources. But Emma had anticipated this too. "Let them spread their stories," she said calmly. "While they're focused on discrediting us, they're missing what's really happening in the valley." Through carefully positioned observers, they learned that Fletcher's operation was larger than it appeared. Behind the visible military presence, he was building a network of informants, trying to map the true extent of the Blackwoods' influence. "He's looking in the wrong places," William observed, studying reports of Fletcher's investigations, searching for a military-style command structure when our real strength lies in something he can't easily see or break. Emma nodded, already implementing the next phase of their strategy. While Fletcher's men watched for obvious defensive preparations, the valley's residents were quietly strengthening bonds that no amount of corporate money or military precision could sever. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Martha called from below. "Riders coming in from the North Valley. Look like Fletcher himself this time." Emma and William exchanged knowing looks. The next phase was beginning sooner than expected. Through their spyglass, they could see Fletcher approaching with a small escort, his military bearing evident even at a distance. "He's coming to negotiate," William noted, recognizing the formal approach. "Which means he's found something he thinks gives him leverage." Emma was already moving to the farmhouse porch, her mind racing with tactical calculations. Fletcher wouldn't risk a personal appearance unless he believed he held a winning hand. The question was, what had he discovered, and how could they turn it to their advantage? The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman prepared to face a different kind of threat, not the brute force of Kane's outlaws, but the calculated precision of a man who had broken other communities through strategy rather than violence. The real battle for Whispering Creek Valley was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Fletcher dismounted with military precision, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. Two aides flanked him, carrying leather portfolios rather than visible weapons. Emma noted how they positioned themselves, not threatening, but ready for any contingency. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Fletcher's voice carried the crisp authority of his former rank. "Captain Marcus Fletcher, representing railroad security interests. I believe we need to discuss the future of Whispering Creek Valley." Emma met his calculating gaze steadily. "An interesting choice of words, Captain, especially coming from someone who spent the past week trying to isolate our community." A flicker of respect crossed Fletcher's weathered features. "Direct and observant. Good. Then we can dispense with pretense." He withdrew a document from one of his aides' portfolios. "I have here territorial authorization to establish official security oversight of all grain shipments through this region. Signed by the governor himself." "Interesting timing," William commented from the porch shadows, "considering the governor's recent railroad investments." Fletcher's head turned sharply, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip before catching himself. "Blackwood, the report said you were remarkable. A marksman who understood strategy as well as shooting. I'm curious, though." His eyes narrowed. How did you anticipate our communication blockade so perfectly? Emma allowed herself a small smile. The same way we knew you'd try buying loyalty before resorting to force. We studied your previous operations, Captain. The patterns were clear to those who knew how to read them. Then you know my record. Fletcher's voice hardened slightly. No community has successfully resisted when I'm tasked with securing railroad interests. Wyoming, Dakota Territory, Idaho, they all learned that progress can't be stopped. Progress? Emma's question carried genuine curiosity. Is that what you call destroying independent farmers to create corporate monopolies? Tell me, Captain, how many communities have you progressed into ruin? Fletcher paced the yard with military precision, his mind visibly working through scenarios. You're different from the others, he finally admitted. Most resistance is emotional, disorganized, but you... He gestured at the subtle defensive improvements to the farm. Every move we make, you've anticipated. Every strategy we implement, you've already countered. Perhaps, William suggested mildly, you're fighting the wrong battle, Captain. You're looking for a military-style organization where you can break through superior forces. What you've found instead is something that can't be defeated through conventional tactics. Fletcher's expression showed he was beginning to understand the true nature of his challenge. He wasn't just facing armed farmers. He was confronting a different kind of strength, one built on generations of frontier wisdom and community bonds. The railroad will have its grain shipments, he stated flatly. One way or another. If not, through cooperation, then through other means, like the other means you used in Wyoming. Emma withdrew her own document. We have reports from families who lived through your pacification operations. Fascinating reading. Especially the parts about how you turn communities against themselves before moving in to restore order. Fletcher's mask of professional detachment cracked slightly. Those records were supposed to be destroyed. The Blackwood family has always understood the importance of preserving truth, Emma explained. While your men were watching our farms, our allies were uncovering the real history of your operations. The families broken, the lives destroyed, all in the name of progress. The sun was setting behind the Bitterroots, painting the valley in deepening shadows. Fletcher studied Emma and William with new understanding, recognizing that he faced something his military experience hadn't prepared him for. This isn't over, he warned, mounting his horse. I have my orders and the resources to carry them out. No one's stopping progress, Captain, Emma replied calmly. We're simply showing there's a way to achieve it without destroying the very communities it's supposed to benefit. As Fletcher and his aides rode away, William watched them through his spyglass. He'll be back. Men like him don't abandon their objectives easily. Emma nodded, already thinking ahead to the next phase of their strategy. Let him come. He'll find what Cain did. That true strength lies not in weapons or tactics, but in the bonds between people who understand what's worth protecting. The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman had revealed another layer of their defense. While Fletcher searched for military targets he could engage, the real power in Whispering Creek Valley lay in something far less tangible, but infinitely stronger. The unbreakable spirit of a community that had learned to stand together against any threat, no matter how sophisticated. The pre-dawn mist clung to Whispering Creek Valley as Emma studied the latest intelligence reports spread across her father's old campaign desk. Fletcher's operation had grown significantly in the past 3 days, with new men and equipment arriving under cover of darkness. He's setting up forward camps here and here, she noted, marking positions on their tactical map. Small groups, 4 to 6 men each, positioned to watch every major trail into the valley. William examined the markings with professional interest. Not just watching. See the supply patterns? He's establishing staging areas for a larger operation. Military, Style, something he learned during the Indian campaigns. Through their network, troubling reports had emerged. Fletcher's men weren't just monitoring movement anymore. They were actively mapping the valley's resources. Every water source, every grain storage facility, every potential defensive position was being documented with military precision. Samuel Chen's boy spotted them testing our irrigation systems, Robert reported, joining them in the modified windmill tower. They're learning how we manage water distribution throughout the valley. Emma's tactical mind saw the implications. Immediately, Fletcher wasn't just planning to control grain shipments, he was preparing to take command of every resource the community needed to survive. He's thinking 3 moves ahead, William observed, studying the pattern of enemy positions. Control the water, you control the harvest. Control the harvest, you control the people. But Fletcher's strategy had revealed something crucial about his assumptions. He was preparing to fight the kind of battle he understood, a military style, campaign for control of physical resources. What he hadn't grasped was the true nature of the valley's strength. "Signal Martha's group," Emma instructed Daniel. "Tell them it's time to implement the second phase of our preparations." In the days since Fletcher's visit, they'd been quietly reorganizing the valley's defenses, not in ways that military training would recognize, but through a deeper understanding of how communities actually functioned. "The Anderson family's ready," Daniel reported. "Their root cellar's been converted just like you showed them. The Millers and Johnsons, too." Throughout the valley, seemingly ordinary farm structures were being transformed. Root cellars became hidden storage facilities. Windmills doubled as observation posts, and innocent-looking irrigation improvements concealed sophisticated methods of controlling water flow. "Fletcher's men are focusing on our visible resources," Emma explained to the gathered farm representatives. "But they don't understand what really sustains a community." William spread out a different kind of map, not of physical terrain, but of human connections. Every family in the valley was marked, along with the skills and resources they could contribute to the common defense. The Chen's knowledge of water management, he pointed out. The Andersons' expertise with grain, storage, the Miller family's network of trading contacts. These are the real resources Fletcher needs to control, and they can't be taken by force. Through their observers, they learned that Fletcher was growing frustrated. His military training told him they must have a central command structure, yet every attempt to identify it led nowhere. The valley's resistance wasn't organized the way he expected. He sent for reinforcements, Robert reported. Another 20 men arriving by week's end, former cavalry like the others. Emma studied this news with thoughtful calculation. He's committing more resources because he thinks we're hiding our true strength. He can't understand that what he's seeing is our strength, not in weapons or tactical positions, but in how we work together. The morning brought more signs of Fletcher's escalating preparations. Supply wagons arrived, carrying not just weapons and ammunition, but sophisticated survey equipment and legal documents. Land office papers, William noted, examining reports from their scouts. Mineral rights claims, water usage permits. He's building a legal framework to justify whatever action he's planning. Emma had anticipated this approach. In the weeks since Kane's defeat, they'd been quietly gathering their own documentation, land grants, water rights, mineral surveys that proved the community's legitimate claims to their resources. "Fletcher's making another mistake," she observed. "He thinks official papers give him authority. He doesn't understand that real authority comes from the people themselves." Daniel burst in with urgent news. "Fletcher's men are taking positions along the rail line. They're stopping grain shipments, claiming security concerns require official inspection of all cargo." This was a classic squeeze tactic, controlled transportation, forcing farmers to deal with the railroad on Fletcher's terms. But Emma had prepared for this too. "Signal the outer farms," she instructed. "Tell them to activate the alternative shipping routes we established. And contact our allies in Helena. It's time they learned what Fletcher's really planning for their territory. William watched the tactical situation evolve with professional appreciation. His daughter wasn't just thinking about defending individual farms anymore. She was orchestrating a response that went beyond mere physical resistance. Fletcher's got the men, the weapons, and the official papers, he mused. Everything a military man would think he needs for victory. But he's fighting a kind of battle he's never encountered before. Through their network, they received word that Fletcher's operation was expanding beyond Whispering Creek Valley. Similar security measures were being implemented in neighboring regions, part of a larger plan to control grain shipping throughout the territory. He's building an empire, Robert observed grimly, using military tactics to establish corporate control over everything that moves by rail. Emma's response was to accelerate their own preparations, but not in ways Fletcher would expect. While his men fortified positions and stockpiled ammunition, the valley's residents were strengthening something far more powerful, their bonds of mutual support and shared determination. "We're not just protecting farms anymore," she explained to the gathered community leaders. "We're defending a way of life, showing that ordinary people can stand against power when they stand together." As evening approached, more reports arrived of Fletcher's preparations. His men were conducting military-style drills, practicing coordinated movements that suggested a large-scale operation was imminent. "He'll move soon," William predicted, studying the enemy positions through his spyglass. "Everything we're seeing points to a coordinated assault, probably within the next few days." But Emma had spotted something in Fletcher's preparations that gave her hope. "Look at his supply lines," she pointed out. "He's building his entire operation on the assumption that he can control physical resources. But he's overlooking the one thing that really gives a community its strength." The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman continued refining their strategy as night fell over Whispering Creek Valley. While Fletcher prepared for the kind of battle his military experience had taught him to expect, they were organizing a defense that went beyond weapons and tactical positions. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Martha's urgent voice carried from below. "Message from the Chen family. Fletcher's men are positioning artillery pieces on Thunder Ridge." This development confirmed Emma's suspicions about Fletcher's ultimate intentions. He wasn't just planning to control the valley, he was preparing to destroy any resistance completely. "Heavy weapons mean he's expecting fortified positions," William observed. "He's still thinking in military terms, fixed defenses he can target and eliminate." Emma's mind was already working through implications and counter-strategies. "Show me the latest survey reports from our outer farms," she instructed Daniel. The young ranch hand produced a series of carefully coded messages, each detailing Fletcher's expanding operation. "Artillery here and here," she marked positions on there. "Tactical map, supply lines running through these passes. He's building a classic siege position, but look at what he's overlooking." William studied the markings with growing appreciation. Fletcher had positioned his forces to control obvious strategic points: high ground, water sources, transportation, routes. But in doing so, he'd revealed crucial assumptions about how he expected the valley's residents to respond. "He thinks we'll concentrate our defenses around the farms," Emma explained to the gathered community leaders. "Fortify obvious positions that his artillery can target." Instead, she revealed a different kind of defensive plan, one that wouldn't appear on any military map. The valley's residents would disperse rather than concentrate, using a network of hidden trails and concealed shelters that Fletcher's men hadn't detected. "The real strength of a community isn't in fixed positions," she reminded them. "It's in our ability to adapt, to support each other in ways an outsider can't predict or prevent." Through their observers, they learned that Fletcher's operation had grown to over 60 men, with more arriving daily. But each new soldier and artillery piece only demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of what he faced. "He's prepared to fight an army," William noted, watching enemy positions through his spyglass. But how do you defeat people who've learned to be strong without becoming a target? As the night deepened, more reports arrived from their network. Fletcher's men were establishing additional guard posts, positioning sharpshooters to cover suspected defensive positions. They were preparing for the kind of resistance they understood: armed confrontation and tactical maneuvering. Let them. Watch the obvious places, Emma instructed her allies. While they're focusing on military targets, we'll be building something they can't easily see or break. The valley's true preparation wasn't visible to Fletcher's observers. It lay in the strengthening bonds between neighbors, the quiet organization of mutual support networks, the sharing of resources and knowledge that would allow the community to endure whatever came. Tomorrow, she told the gathered farm representatives, Fletcher will likely make his move. He'll expect us to either surrender to his superior force or resist in ways his artillery can counter. Instead, we'll show him a kind of strength his military experience hasn't prepared him to face. The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman had transformed their defense of Whispering Creek Valley into something unprecedented. While Fletcher assembled a formidable military force, they were demonstrating that true power lay not in weapons or tactical positions, but in the unbreakable spirit of a community that had learned to stand together against any threat. As midnight approached, Emma made her final preparations. She'd positioned their allies carefully, not to fight Fletcher's forces directly, but to protect what really mattered: the bonds of trust and mutual support that gave their community its true strength. He's expecting a battle, she told her, father watching Fletcher's campfires burn in the distance. Instead, he's going to learn why some things can't be defeated by force alone. William nodded, understanding what his daughter had accomplished. She hadn't just organized a defense. She'd awakened something that no amount of military power could easily overcome. The real battle for Whispering Creek Valley was about to begin, and it would be fought with weapons that even a skilled tactician like Marcus Fletcher might not recognize until it was too late. Dawn painted Whispering Creek Valley in shades of steel gray as Fletcher's operation began its move. Artillery pieces on Thunder Ridge opened fire, their shells targeting what his scouts had identified as key defensive positions. The explosions echoed across the valley, but found only empty barns and abandoned storage sheds. First wave moving through the North Pass, William reported from their observation post. 4 mounted groups, 20 men each. Classic cavalry formation. Emma studied the enemy's advance through her spyglass. Fletcher's men moved with military precision, securing positions according to standard army doctrine. But they were already encountering problems they hadn't anticipated. The valley's farmers had spent weeks preparing the terrain. What looked like solid ground often concealed carefully engineered soft spots. Cavalry charges faltered as horses pounded in unexpected mud. Supply wagons found themselves stuck on what appeared to be well-traveled roads. Chen family signals from the East Ridge, Daniel reported. Fletcher's second wave is moving into position. They're carrying blasting equipment. Looks like they're planning to target the irrigation system. Emma's response was immediate but unexpected. Signal Martha's group. Tell them to open the secondary channels. Throughout the valley, hidden sluice gates activated. Water began flowing in patterns Fletcher's men hadn't mapped, turning their carefully planned approach routes into treacherous ground. The military precision of their advance began to break down as units found themselves cut off from each other by suddenly flooded terrain. Remarkable, William observed, watching the confusion spread through enemy ranks. They're trained to fight opposition, not the land itself. Fletcher's response came quickly. His artillery shifted targets, trying to destroy what they assumed were central control points for the valley's water management. But Emma had anticipated this too. There is no central control, she explained to Robert, as more shells fell harmlessly on decoy positions. Every family knows how to manage their section of the system. You can't break it by targeting any single point. Through their network, they learned that Fletcher's frustration was growing. His men were reporting resistance, but couldn't identify any clear targets to engage. The valley's defenders seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, their influence felt but never concentrated enough to counter with military force. "Third wave deploying along the southern ridge," Daniel reported. "They're setting up Gatling guns to cover the grain storage areas." Emma nodded, having expected this development. "Signal the Thompson family. Tell them it's time to show Fletcher why focusing on obvious targets is a mistake." As Fletcher's men trained their weapons on visible grain warehouses, they failed to notice the real movement of resources happening right under their noses. The valley's harvest was being redistributed through a network of hidden storage spaces. Root cellars converted to grain bins, old mine shafts repurposed for secure storage, every family protecting not just their own crops, but their neighbors as well. "Fletcher's sending scouts to investigate the western trails," William noted, "tracking enemy movements. He thinks we must have a supply line he can cut." Indeed, Fletcher's military experience told him that any organized resistance needed centralized supply routes. His men were searching for convoys to intercept, supply trains to capture. Instead, they found a community that had learned to share and distribute resources in ways that couldn't be easily disrupted. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Martha's voice carried urgency. "Fletcher's men are approaching the main house. Looks like he's coming himself this time." Emma moved to the farmhouse porch, her manner calm, despite the artillery fire still echoing across the valley. Fletcher rode up with a small escort, his military bearing at odds with the growing disorder in his ranks. "Impressive engineering." "Mrs. Hawthorne," he called out, gesturing at the flooded terrain that had disrupted his advance. "But you must realize you can't maintain this resistance indefinitely. My forces control every official access point to this valley." "Official access points," Emma replied mildly. "Interesting choice of words. Tell me, Captain, how well did controlling official routes work for you in Wyoming, before local knowledge made your roadblocks irrelevant?" Fletcher's expression tightened. He'd lost effective control of 3 different territories precisely because he'd focused on official channels while local residents simply created unofficial ones. "This is different," he insisted. "I have artillery, Gatling guns, enough men to occupy every strategic position in this valley. Your people can't fight that kind of force." "We're not fighting your force, Captain," Emma explained calmly. "We're showing you why force alone can't control a community that understands its true strength." As if to emphasize her point, more signals flashed from distant farms. Fletcher's men were reporting new problems. Supply wagons found mysteriously empty, ammunition stocks depleted by unknown means, food and water sources compromised. "Impossible," Fletcher muttered, reading the reports. "We have men watching every approach. Nothing could move without our knowledge." "Nothing obvious," William commented from the porch shadows. "But a community isn't just roads and supply lines, Captain. It's connections you can't see or control, support that flows through channels you'd never think to watch." Fletcher's tactical mind struggled with this challenge. His military training had taught him to identify and target enemy strengths, but how do you defeat an opponent whose power lies in the invisible bonds between neighbors? "Signal received from the outer farms," Daniel reported. "Fletcher's reinforcements have encountered unexpected difficulties. Their guides seem to have led them into Box Canyon." This was another aspect of the valley's defense. Local knowledge, passed down through generations, was being used to confound and redirect enemy movements. Fletcher's men found themselves facing not armed resistance, but the accumulated wisdom of people who knew every hidden trail and false path in their territory. "You're trying to break something that can't be broken by force, the strength of People who've learned to protect each other in ways your military experience hasn't prepared you to counter. Fletcher dismounted, his movements betraying growing tension. You don't understand what you're really facing, Mrs. Hawthorne. This isn't just about your valley anymore. The railroad's expansion can't be stopped by local resistance. No one's trying to stop progress, Captain, Emma replied. We're simply showing there's a way to achieve it without destroying communities in the process. Through their observers, they learned that Fletcher's operation was facing unprecedented challenges. His men, trained for conventional military engagements, found themselves confronting a form of resistance that defied their tactical doctrine. Northern units reporting complete ammunition depletion, an aide reported urgently. Southern groups' rations have been compromised, supplies spoiled somehow. Western Patrol lost contact entirely. Fletcher's military mind struggled to process these developments. His forces controlled all visible strategic positions, yet they couldn't maintain effective combat operations. Every attempt to establish tactical superiority was met not with direct resistance, but with the quiet dissolution of their combat effectiveness. You've studied military strategy, Mrs. Hawthorne, Fletcher observed, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. These aren't just farmers' tricks. This is sophisticated tactical thinking. My father taught me more than marksmanship, Emma acknowledged. He showed me that true strength isn't about who has the most guns or best positions. It's about understanding how communities really work. As if to emphasize her point, more signals flashed across the valley. Fletcher's artillery. Crews were reporting mechanical problems, crucial parts mysteriously missing, firing mechanisms jammed by unknown means. His cavalry units found their horses refusing to drink from water sources that seemed perfectly clear. This is impossible, Fletcher muttered, reading report after report of unexplainable equipment failures and supply problems. We control every approach, every strategic position. Do you? William's question carried genuine curiosity. Or do you just control what military training taught you to think of as strategic? Emma watched understanding slowly dawn in Fletcher's eyes. His forces had occupied the high ground, secured the roads, and positioned their weapons for maximum tactical advantage. But they had missed entirely the true strength of what they faced. Your men are occupying positions, she explained quietly, while we're showing you what really makes a community strong. It's not the hills or the roads or the bridges, Captain. It's the connections between people. Connections your military force can't see or break. Through their network came reports of Fletcher's operation continuing to unravel. Units that should have been securing key positions were instead dealing with mysterious equipment failures. Supply lines that looked secure on tactical maps proved unable to deliver effective support. Signal from the Chen family, Daniel reported. Fletcher's eastern units are pulling back. Their equipment's failing faster than they can repair it. This was the true sophistication of the valley's defense. While Fletcher's men watched for armed resistance, the community's real strength was being demonstrated in ways no military force could effectively counter. You're facing a choice, Captain, Emma told Fletcher as more reports of his operation's deterioration arrived. Continue trying to break something you can't break with force, or recognize that true progress comes from working with communities, not against them. Fletcher stood in silence, his tactical mind finally grasping the full implications of what he faced. His military experience had taught him to identify and engage enemy strong points. But how do you defeat an opponent whose strength lies not in tactical positions or armed resistance, but in the invisible bonds of mutual support and shared determination? The sun climbed higher over Whispering Creek Valley as Fletcher's operation continued to disintegrate. Not through direct combat or tactical defeat, but through the quiet demonstration that some things can't be controlled by military force alone. Tell Pierce, Fletcher finally spoke, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who recognized fundamental change was needed, that his railroad will need to find a different way. You can't defeat a community that's learned to protect itself. Like this, the quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman watched Fletcher mount up and ride away. They had demonstrated something profound, that true power doesn't always flow from the barrel of a gun or the ability to occupy strategic positions. Sometimes it comes from understanding that the strongest defenses are the ones that can't be seen or broken by force alone. The Montana afternoon cast. Montana afternoon. Long shadows across Whispering Creek Valley as Emma studied an urgent message delivered by one of their scouts. Her expression remained calm, but William noticed the subtle tension in her bearing. "Pierce is coming," she announced, passing the message to her father. "Not just him, the railroad's entire board of directors. Special train is arriving tomorrow." William read the intelligence with growing concern. They wouldn't risk traveling here unless something significant had changed. What else did our people discover? Through their network, disturbing details emerged. Pierce wasn't just bringing railroad executives. He'd assembled a formidable team of corporate lawyers, territorial officials, and financial representatives from eastern banks. "They're carrying legal documents," Robert reported, returning from scouting the rail line. "Whole trunks full, and there's something else. They've got a special passenger, Judge Harrison McCullough himself." Emma's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. McCullough wasn't just any judge. He was the territory's chief justice, known for decisions that invariably favored corporate interests over local rights. "Pierce is changing strategies," she observed, spreading out their latest intelligence reports. "Fletcher's military approach failed, so now they're bringing their true power to bear: money, law, and political influence." Daniel burst in with fresh news. "Telegraph lines to Helena are humming. Railroads' lawyers have filed emergency motions, something about critical transportation infrastructure and national security concerns." This was Pierce's masterstroke. By declaring the grain shipments a matter of national importance, he could bypass local authorities entirely, bringing federal power to bear against the valley's resistance. "Look at these legal filings," William said grimly, examining documents. Their allies had intercepted. They're not just trying to control shipping anymore. They're attempting to establish a legal precedent that would give corporations authority over any resource they deem critical to national development. Emma's mind raced through implications. Pierce wasn't just fighting for control of one valley. He was trying to create a legal framework that would allow corporate interests to override local rights throughout the entire frontier. "Signal Martha's group," she instructed Daniel. "Tell them to activate our legal network. It's time to show Pierce that some battles can't be won in courtrooms alone." Throughout the valley, a different kind of preparation began. While Pierce assembled legal documents, the community mobilized its own resources. Not guns or tactical positions this time, but generations of accumulated knowledge about how power really worked in the territory. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Robert called urgently. "More riders coming in. Looks like newspapermen from back east. Railroads brought the press to witness whatever they're planning." Emma allowed herself a slight smile. Pierce thought he was controlling the narrative, but he didn't understand what he was really walking into. "Let them come," she said quietly. "Sometimes the best way to counter a story is to reveal the truth behind it." Through their observers, they learned more details of Pierce's plan. The railroad wasn't just filing legal motions. They were attempting to rewrite the very foundations of territorial law, creating precedents that would give corporations unprecedented control over frontier resources. "They're claiming emergency powers," William noted, studying reports from their sources in Helena, arguing that local resistance to corporate authority threatens national development. If they succeed, no community will be safe from corporate takeover. Emma spread out a different kind of map, not of terrain or tactical positions, but of connections and influences throughout the territory. Every mark showed relationships between officials, business interests, and the hidden channels through which true power flowed. Pierce thinks he's just fighting farmers, she explained to the gathered community leaders. He doesn't understand that we've been preparing for this kind of battle longer than he knows. From hidden caches throughout the valley came carefully preserved documents, evidence of corporate corruption, records of illegal deals, proof of how railroad interests had systematically undermined local rights across the frontier. Your father taught you well, Samuel Chen observed, examining the extensive documentation. This isn't just about protecting our farms anymore, it's about exposing the truth about how power really works in this territory. Emma nodded, her tactical mind already seeing patterns in Pierce's approach. He's bringing law, money, and political influence to bear, but he's overlooking something crucial, the power of truth, when a community stands together to protect it. Through their network came reports of Pierce's special train approaching the territory. But while he assembled legal and political power, the valley's residents were preparing to reveal something no amount of corporate influence could easily suppress. Signal Catherine Wells at the territorial newspaper, Emma instructed Daniel. Tell her it's time to publish what we've discovered. Let's show Pierce why some stories can't be controlled by corporate power alone. The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman were about to face their most challenging battle yet, not against guns or military tactics, but against the very systems of power that controlled the American frontier. And they would fight it not with weapons, but with the most dangerous force Pierce's corporate empire could face, the truth itself. As night fell over Whispering Creek Valley, more crucial intelligence arrived. Pierce's train carried not just legal documents, but evidence of his own, carefully crafted stories about dangerous elements threatening territorial development. He's trying to paint us as outlaws, William observed, reading intercepted press materials, claiming our resistance threatens the very future of the frontier. Emma studied these developments with tactical precision. Pierce thinks he can control the narrative because he controls the official channels, but he's about to learn why some stories can't be contained by corporate power. Through their network, they discovered Pierce had assembled an impressive array of witnesses, bought-off officials ready to testify about the dangers of local resistance, experts prepared to explain why corporate control was necessary for in progress. Look at these depositions, Robert said, examining documents their allies had obtained. They're not just trying to take our farms. They're attempting to establish legal precedent that would give corporations authority over any resource. Their claim is vital to national interests. Emma's response was to implement the next phase of their strategy. While Pierce prepared his legal assault, she mobilized a different kind of power. The accumulated truth about how corporate interests had systematically undermined frontier communities. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Martha called urgently. "Message from Helena. Railroad's lawyers have filed emergency motions with every territorial court. This was Pierce's master stroke, a coordinated legal attack designed to overwhelm local resistance with the sheer weight of corporate legal power." But Emma had anticipated this too. "Send word to Judge Blackwood in Fort Benton," she instructed Daniel. "Tell him it's time to reveal what we discovered about judicial corruption in the Dakota Territory cases." William watched his daughter's strategy unfold with quiet pride. She wasn't just fighting Pierce's legal maneuvers. She was preparing to expose the entire system of corruption that made corporate dominance possible. Through carefully placed sources, they learned more details of Pierce's plan. The railroad wasn't just seeking control of grain shipments. They were attempting to establish a precedent that would allow corporate interests to seize any resource they deemed necessary for national development. "Signal our allies in the press," Emma directed. Not just Catherine Wells, every independent newspaper in the territory. It's time they learned the real story behind corporate progress. From hidden archives throughout the valley came carefully preserved evidence, documents showing how railroad interests had systematically corrupted territorial officials, records of illegal land seizures, proof of how corporate power had been used to break other communities that tried to resist. "Pierce thinks he's fighting farmers defending their land," Emma explained to the gathered community leaders. "He doesn't understand. He's about to face something far more dangerous, the truth about how corporate power really operates in this territory." The first light of dawn revealed Pierce's special train approaching the valley. But while he brought lawyers, judges, and corporate power to bear, Emma and William had prepared a different kind of response. One that would expose not just individual corruption, but the entire system that allowed corporate interests to dominate frontier life. "They've got the law, the money, and the political influence," William observed, watching the trains approach through his spyglass. "But they've forgotten something crucial: the power of truth when a community stands together to protect it." The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman prepared for their most crucial battle yet. While Pierce assembled legal and political power, they had gathered something far more potent, evidence that could expose how corporate interests had systematically undermined the very foundations of frontier justice. "Send the signal," Emma instructed as Pierce's train pulled into the station. "Let's show them why some things can't be controlled by corporate power alone." Throughout Whispering Creek Valley, a carefully prepared response began to unfold, not with guns or tactical maneuvers this time, but with the systematic revelation of truth that no amount of corporate influence could easily suppress. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be fought with weapons that even Pierce's assembled legal might couldn't easily counter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Pierce's contingent prepared to implement their master plan. But Emma and William had transformed their defense into something larger, a challenge not just to corporate power, but to the very systems that allowed that power to dominate frontier life. They were about to demonstrate why some battles couldn't be won through legal maneuvering alone, and why the truth, properly protected and revealed, remained the most potent force for justice in the American West. Pierce's legal assault began with the precision of a well-planned military campaign. Judge McCullough convened an emergency session in the Whispering Creek Town Hall, its simple wooden walls now witness to a sophisticated attack on frontier justice itself. The railroad hereby petitions for emergency powers under territorial statute. Pierce's chief lawyer, Edward Blackwood, no relation, announced to the packed room, given clear evidence that organized resistance threatens vital transportation infrastructure. Emma sat quietly beside her father, watching the proceedings with tactical awareness. Pierce had assembled an impressive array of legal firepower, not just local attorneys, but corporate lawyers from Chicago and New York, each armed with precedents and arguments designed to overwhelm any resistance. "We submit evidence," Blackwood continued, "documented proof that certain elements in this valley have systematically interfered with legitimate business operations, endangering the territory's economic development." Through their network, Emma and William learned that Pierce's legal team had been preparing this attack for months. They'd gathered depositions from corrupt officials, manufactured evidence of criminal conspiracy, and carefully crafted a narrative that painted the valley's resistance as a threat to progress itself. "Your Honor," Pierce's lawyer presented document after document, "these affidavits demonstrate a pattern of organized opposition to vital infrastructure development. We seek immediate federal receivership of all agricultural operations in Whispering Creek Valley." Emma noticed how the corporate lawyers had positioned themselves, not just physically in the courtroom, but strategically, building an argument that would set precedent far beyond their community. "They're not just trying to take control of our farms," she whispered to William. "They're attempting to establish legal framework that would let them seize any resource they claim is critical to national interests." The judge, clearly sympathetic to railroad interests, began issuing preliminary rulings that threatened to unravel everything the valley's residents had built. First came injunctions against unauthorized gatherings of farmers, then restrictions on private grain storage. Each decision stripped away another layer of community independence. This court finds compelling evidence of organized resistance to legitimate corporate authority, McCullough intoned. Under territorial statute, emergency measures are hereby, Your Honor. A new voice cut through the proceedings. Catherine Wells, editor of the territorial newspaper, strode into the courtroom with a thick portfolio. "The press requests permission to submit relevant evidence regarding this matter." Pierce's lawyers immediately objected, but Catherine was already distributing copies of her latest edition. The headline read, "Exposed: Railroad's Secret Plan to Seize Frontier Lands Through Manufactured Crisis." "Order in the court," McCullough demanded. But the damage was done. The carefully crafted corporate narrative began showing its first cracks as Catherine's evidence circulated through the room. Yet Pierce had anticipated potential press interference. His team quickly produced their own expert witnesses, bought and paid for, journalists ready to testify about the dangers of local resistance to corporate authority. "This is a matter of national security," Pierce himself addressed the court. "Uncontrolled local elements threaten the very foundation of territorial development. We require immediate federal intervention." Emma watched the proceedings with growing concern. Pierce's legal strategy was more sophisticated than they'd anticipated. He wasn't just attacking their rights directly. He was trying to change the very definition of those rights. "Signal Martha's group," she whispered to Daniel. "Tell them to implement the contingency plan." But Pierce's team had prepared for conventional resistance. As the court session continued, railroad agents moved to seize control of key facilities throughout the valley. Legal papers in hand, they began asserting corporate authority over grain storage, water resources, and transportation routes. "This court hereby grants temporary receivership of all agricultural operations to Northern Pacific Railroad," McCullough announced, "pending full review of evidence concerning organized resistance to legitimate corporate authority." The ruling hit the community like a physical blow. Pierce's legal strategy had achieved what Fletcher's military force couldn't: official sanction for corporate takeover of their resources. "We've lost the farms," Robert reported grimly, returning from watching railroad agents post legal notices. "They're placing everything under corporate receivership." But Emma's tactical mind was already working through implications and counter-strategies. While Pierce celebrated his apparent victory, she was seeing patterns in his approach that revealed crucial weaknesses. "He thinks he's won because he controls the legal process," she observed quietly. "But he's overlooked something fundamental about how justice really works in this territory." William studied his daughter's expression, recognizing the look that meant she'd spotted something others had missed. "What has Pierce forgotten in his legal maneuvering?" "That true justice," Emma replied, "doesn't just flow from courtroom decisions. It comes from the people's understanding of what's right. And we're about to show him why some things can't be controlled by legal papers alone." Through their network, disturbing reports emerged. Pierce's agents were moving systematically through the valley, posting eviction notices and corporate receivership documents. But they encountered something they hadn't expected. Not violent resistance, but calm, organized non-compliance. "They can't physically remove everyone," Emma explained to the gathered community leaders, "and they can't run the farms without our knowledge and cooperation." William watched railroad agents struggling to assert their newly granted authority. Pierce thinks legal papers give him control. He's about to learn why some things can't be taken by court order. The corporate lawyers had anticipated conventional legal challenges. What they faced instead was something their legal training hadn't prepared them for. A community that understood its strength lay not in legal arguments, but in the practical reality of how farms actually operated. "Report from the Chen family," Daniel announced. Railroad agents tried implementing their new management procedures. Found out nobody knows how to work the irrigation systems properly. Similar stories emerged across the valley. Corporate representatives armed with legal authority discovered that farming required more than just papers and procedures. Each property had its quirks, its specific needs that only experienced hands understood. "Your Honor," Pierce's lawyer addressed Judge McCullough again, "we require immediate federal assistance. The local population is actively impeding legitimate corporate management through what?" Emma asked quietly. "Through knowing their own land. Through understanding things your corporate procedures can't capture." Pierce himself showed signs of frustration. His legal victory was proving hollow. While he had official authority, he couldn't transform that authority into practical control. "This is deliberate obstruction," he argued before the court. "These people are defying legitimate corporate authority." But Emma had prepared for this moment. "No obstruction, Mr. Pierce. Just the simple truth that farming isn't something you can control through legal papers. Each field, each irrigation channel, each storage facility requires knowledge that can't be written in corporate manuals." The crisis point wasn't playing out as Pierce had expected. His legal team had won the courtroom battle, but they were losing the practical war. Corporate agents found themselves unable to manage properties they technically controlled. "Signal from the outer farms," Robert reported. "Railroads brought in their own agricultural experts. They're trying to implement standardized farming procedures." Emma allowed herself a slight smile. "Let them try. They'll learn why local knowledge matters more than corporate efficiency." Through their observers, they learned Pierce's operation was facing unexpected challenges. His agricultural experts, trained in modern scientific methods, found themselves confronting farming conditions that defied their standardized approaches. "This land doesn't yield to corporate procedures," William observed, watching Pierce's experts struggle with local conditions. "It responds to generations of accumulated wisdom." The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman watched Pierce's apparent victory transform into practical defeat. While he controlled the legal process, he was discovering that true authority in farming communities came from something deeper than court orders. "They can post their notices," Emma told the gathered farmers. "They can claim legal authority, but they can't make the land yield without our cooperation, without our understanding of how things really work." The crisis had revealed something crucial about the nature of power in frontier communities. Pierce's legal strategy had given him official authority, but he was learning that some things couldn't be controlled through courtroom victories alone. Evening approached. More reports arrived of Pierce's practical difficulties. His corporate management system, designed for efficiency and standardization, was proving useless in the face of local agricultural realities. "Your court orders can't change basic truths, Mr. Pierce," Emma addressed him directly as his frustration mounted. "You can't run these farms without the knowledge and cooperation of the people who truly understand them." The quiet farmer's widow and the legendary marksman had transformed their apparent defeat into something unexpected. While Pierce celebrated his legal victory, they were demonstrating why some authority couldn't be granted by judges or enforced by corporate agents. The real power in Whispering Creek Valley didn't lie in legal documents or court orders, but in the deep understanding of how the land actually worked. Knowledge that couldn't be seized by legal mandate or replaced by corporate procedures. As the days wore on, Pierce's frustration grew. His lawyers pushed for more aggressive measures, demanding the full backing of the federal government, but Emma knew the longer the standoff continued, the more Pierce would expose his ignorance of the valley's intricate systems. With each passing day, the corporate effort grew more strained, their appointed experts failing to make headway in the fields, their procedures coming unraveled. The railroad agents had no choice but to return to the drawing board, their high-handed approach to local farming rendered ineffective by the stubbornness of the land itself. But Pierce, ever the strategist, began to change his tactics. Instead of leaning entirely on legal authority, he began to shift his focus toward dividing the community. Whispering Creek had always been a patchwork of allegiances and old rivalries, but the recent crisis had united the farmers in ways Pierce had never anticipated. Realizing this, he deployed agents to begin sowing seeds of distrust. They began offering sweet deals to certain landowners, attempting to break the solidarity Emma and William had worked so hard to build. They offered tax breaks, promises of infrastructure improvements, and even the quiet suggestion that resisting the railroad might cost some families their futures. At first, the tactics seemed to work. A few isolated families, tempted by the promises of easy wealth and security, began to waver. Slowly, a fracture appeared in the united front the farmers had forged. Emma, aware of the creeping division, convened a secret meeting with William and the other leaders of the resistance. "We've seen this before," Emma said, her voice steady. "This is how they've always broken us. Divide and conquer. They're preying on our fear, our isolation." "I know," William replied, his brow furrowing as he leaned forward, "but we can't let them have that foothold. We have to remind them what they're really up against." Emma nodded. "Exactly. We remind them of what happens when you try to control something that doesn't want to be controlled." The next day, a new strategy began to take shape. Emma, William, and the community leaders set out to do what the corporate lawyers and agents couldn't. They used the very tools Pierce's team had neglected: community trust, shared knowledge, and solidarity. The farmers who had begun to show signs of wavering received quiet but firm reminders of their shared history. Emma and the leaders approached the fence-sitters directly, speaking not in legal terms, but in terms of practical survival. The kind of survival only the people who lived and worked the land could understand. "We're not just fighting for our land," Emma told one landowner as they stood together overlooking his fields. "We're fighting for a way of life. The railroad doesn't care about this land. It doesn't care about the generations that have worked it. It only cares about what it can take." The words, simple and direct, began to have their effect. The waverers slowly turned back toward the fold, realizing that no amount of legalese could ever replace the decades of wisdom and tradition that ran through their veins. They were farmers, not just in occupation but in identity. Pierce and his team couldn't replicate that. The tension that had plagued the valley for months began to shift, the tide slowly turning back in the farmers' favor. The cracks in Pierce's legal armor widened as he faced a community more resolute than ever, and his agents found themselves more and more isolated in the face of mass resistance. In an unexpected move, Pierce, realizing the battle was slipping from his grasp, called for a meeting with Emma. He requested an audience, and she agreed, if only to hear him out. When Pierce arrived at the meeting, he was a man on the defensive, stripped of his usual swagger. His lawyers had failed him. His agents were losing ground. The legal victories he'd secured were quickly turning into Pyrrhic ones. His arrogance had cost him. "Emma," Pierce began, his voice tight with frustration, "I've been thinking about this. I've had the law on my side, but you're right. There's more at stake here than just land or resources. You've made me see that." Emma raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting him continue. "I can't win this through the courts," he admitted, his tone grudging. "You've got something I can't touch, the people's trust, their loyalty. I underestimated that." Emma remained silent for a moment. "So what are you offering, Pierce?" she asked quietly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not offering anything," he said quickly. "I'm saying it's over. I've lost." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But mark my words, this isn't the last we'll see of each other. The railroad's plans, they don't just stop here. You've won this round, but I'll be back, and next time we won't be playing by the same rules." Emma studied him for a long moment, measuring his words. "We'll be ready for whatever and comes next," she said, the weight of her statement settling heavily in the air. "But for now, you're right. It's over." With that, Pierce stood, the tension between them thick and palpable. He didn't offer a handshake or even a nod of respect, but instead left the room in silence, his defeat acknowledged only by the weight of his departure. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, the farmers of Whispering Creek gathered once more, their ranks united. The legal battles were far from over, but Emma knew that this victory, this reaffirmation of their collective power, would be what carried them through the next fight. Pierce had underestimated the strength of their resolve, and in the end, that was a mistake he would never make again. The weeks that followed Pierce's retreat were tense, but filled with a quiet resolve. Emma and William, though relieved by their victory, knew this was but one battle in a much larger war. The railroad's legal maneuvers may have faltered, but their power was far from gone. They still held sway in many circles of influence, and, while Pierce's immediate attempts to seize the valley had been thwarted, the corporation would certainly return with new strategies, new pressures, and more resources. Emma understood the delicate balance they now faced. The community had rallied around their shared understanding of the land, but that unity needed constant cultivation, particularly in the face of future corporate encroachments. They couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. This victory had given them a breathing space, but Emma had learned long ago that it was the moments between battles that defined the true strength of a cause. Over the coming months, Emma organized regular meetings, not just to plan for future resistance, but to ensure that the community remained strong and cohesive. They worked to deepen ties with neighboring farmers and settlers who might have been swayed by Pierce's promises. Word spread beyond the valley about how the people of Whispering Creek had stood up to the railroad, and more families, many of whom had been neutral or undecided, began to reach out, eager to join the cause. Emma knew that to win the larger fight, they needed a broader base of support. They couldn't afford to allow a fracture, however small, to reopen. Meanwhile, William kept close watch over the land, always mindful of the changing seasons and the ever-present need to adapt to new challenges. It was during this time that he took to repairing and improving the valley's irrigation systems, a symbol of their resolve not just to survive, but to thrive. It was a quiet act of defiance, a reminder to anyone who doubted their commitment, that they would not be pushed off their land, not by legal decrees, and certainly not by external forces who didn't understand the valley's soul. But Pierce, for all his failures, was not a man easily discouraged. He had been emboldened by the power of the legal system, and his mind had already begun turning once again. Instead of trying to seize control directly through the courts, he shifted his focus to more subtle forms of pressure. With his influence, he began lobbying for new laws in the territorial legislature, ones that would further empower corporations to override local governance, even in areas like land use, water, rights, and agricultural practices. A new bill surfaced, introduced by one of Pierce's allies in the legislature. It was written in carefully worded legalese, but its implications were clear. It would give corporations the right to seize land, not just for national interests, but under the guise of resource optimization. The railroad would be able to control water rights, dictate farming procedures, and even dictate the terms of crop sales, all under the pretense of ensuring that local economies adhered to modern, efficient practices. Emma, when she caught wind of the bill, knew immediately that it was more dangerous than anything they had faced before. This was not a fight they could win just through public defiance. If the bill passed, it would erase much of the hard-won ground they had fought for. The valley's future would be in peril, so Emma turned her focus once again to the community, but this time she needed to bring in every ally they could muster from across the territory. She called upon Martha and the group of activists that had assisted them in the past, as well as sympathetic legislators and those within the press who had helped expose Pierce's earlier plots. Catherine Wells, ever steadfast, was ready with her pen once again, and together they began organizing a coordinated effort to resist the new bill. "What we need now," Emma said as she outlined the strategy to William and their trusted allies, "is to take the fight to the legislature. We need a groundswell of public opinion. We need to make sure every person who values their land, their independence, their right to self-determination, understands just how much this bill would cost them." The resistance took the form of public hearings, speeches, and petitions. Emma knew it wouldn't be enough to simply oppose the bill on moral grounds. Too many corporate interests had already cemented their power in the legislature. So they took a different approach, one that used Pierce's own arguments against him. They focused on the bill's supposed benefits to the local economy and began systematically proving that it would actually harm the very communities it claimed to protect. Catherine Wells wrote editorial after editorial, exposing the true costs of the bill, the monopolization of land and water rights, the destruction of local autonomy, and the erosion of farming independence. At town halls across the territory, Emma spoke passionately about the dangers of centralized corporate control, stressing the importance of local knowledge and the true cost of progress at the expense of people's rights. But the real turning point came when Martha's group, which had been conducting a series of covert surveys of the surrounding areas, discovered something troubling. Railroad agents were already approaching local businesses and farmers, offering them large sums in exchange for cooperation with the new bill's provisions. They were buying off key figures, convincing them that the bill's passage was inevitable and that working with the railroad would ensure their prosperity. It was a brilliant and insidious tactic, but it also revealed just how desperate Pierce's campaign had become. Emma, always one step ahead, organized an urgent meeting of the valley's leaders. "We know what they're doing," she said, her eyes steely with resolve. "They're trying to buy influence before the bill even goes to vote. But we can't let that happen. If they think they can purchase our future, they'll learn just how much we're willing to fight." The community's response was swift and firm. Together, they rallied in opposition, organizing one of the largest public demonstrations the territory had ever seen. They called it the Farmers' Day of Resistance, a mass gathering where people from across the valley and even surrounding territories came together to voice their opposition to the bill. Families came in wagons, on horseback, and on foot, waving banners and carrying signs that read, "This land is ours, and we choose our future." The day of the rally was nothing short of spectacular. When the press turned up, they found not just farmers, but teachers, shopkeepers, miners, and families all standing together, united not by a single issue, but by a common understanding of what they stood to lose. Even those who had previously been swayed by the railroad's promises came to realize they had been misled. As the speeches rang out, as Emma spoke of the community's strength, their resilience, and their right to self-govern, something shifted. The fear that had once taken root in their hearts began to dissolve, replaced by a fierce determination. By the time the legislative vote arrived, the tide had turned. Pierce, for all his legal maneuvering and corporate power, found that he was up against something far more formidable than he had anticipated: the collective will of a community that refused to be controlled. The bill was voted down, its provisions stripped away by an overwhelming wave of resistance from farmers, citizens, and those who believed that the land should remain in the hands of those who lived on it. Emma's victory was not just one of legal strategy, but of something far more fundamental: community power. And as the valley breathed a sigh of relief, she knew that for now they had won. But as she gazed over the horizon, she also knew this victory, while hard-won, was only the beginning of the fight. For in the territories, power was always shifting, and there would always be another battle on the horizon. And so, the farmers of Whispering Creek, bound by their knowledge, their land, and their unbreakable unity, prepared for whatever came next, ready to defend not just their homes, but the very way of life that had sustained them for generations. The victory over the railroad bill was a powerful symbol of the community's resolve, but Emma and William knew that, in the world they inhabited, no success was ever permanent. Corporate interests never slept. They simply evolved. The railroad may have been momentarily thwarted, but it was clear to Emma that the battle was far from over. The valley's hard-won triumph had made them a target, and their unity would be tested again and again. Still, for the moment, the valley was a place of cautious optimism. The farmers had regained control, their fields were once again theirs to tend, and the unity forged in the fires of resistance had transformed into something more enduring: solidarity that would last far beyond any courtroom battle or political maneuver. Emma continued to work tirelessly, not only defending what they had won, but strengthening the fabric of their community. Every crop harvested, every field tilled, was a reminder of their resilience. They were more than just farmers. They were stewards of a land that no paper could ever truly possess. But in the months following the defeat of the railroad bill, a new tension began to rise in the valley. Word spread that Pierce was not just going to fade into the background. No, he was preparing for something far more insidious. He had begun to enlist even more influential allies: politicians, land speculators, and even bankers, who were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to achieve his vision of controlling the frontier's resources. Emma began to hear rumors of a new strategy, one that sought to break down the very idea of local autonomy by turning the land into a financial commodity, something to be bought and sold at the whim of powerful men with deep pockets and influence. In Washington, the first signs of this shift appeared when a group of wealthy investors arrived in the valley, led by a man named Frank Aldridge, a financier with ties to some of the most powerful railroads in the country. Aldridge was a cold, calculating man who spoke in a language of growth and development, terms that to the farmers felt foreign and menacing. "A new era is coming," Aldridge declared at a town meeting, his voice smooth but firm. Whispering, "Greek is on the edge of something great, but it needs the right kind of leadership to make that greatness possible. The land, the resources, everything here, it can be developed into a thriving hub for commerce, for industry, for prosperity." Emma listened to him with growing wariness. She had heard this rhetoric before. It was the same line that had been used to justify the encroachment of railroads, the same promises that masked the destruction of communities for the sake of corporate profit. "We can take this valley to new heights," Aldridge continued. "All we need is for you to trust in the future, to trust in the investments we're making in infrastructure. We're prepared to offer generous deals for anyone willing to partner with us. The opportunities here are unlike anything you've seen." Emma stood up, her gaze unwavering. "What you call opportunities, Mr. Aldridge, are nothing more than a way to erase the very essence of what this community is. This land is not yours to sell. It's ours to care for, to preserve, to pass on to the next generation. You won't turn it into another cog in a corporate machine." The room fell silent for a moment, and Emma felt every eye in the room upon her. Aldridge, to his credit, didn't flinch, though his eyes narrowed. "Miss Clark, you may think you're protecting something important, but the world is changing, and if you don't change with it, you'll be left behind. The railroad will keep moving forward with or without your consent." It was then that Emma understood the new direction of the battle. It wasn't just about the railroad anymore. It was about the larger forces of industrialization and financialization that were sweeping across the West. Pierce, Aldridge, and their allies had realized that if they couldn't control the valley through legal means, they would simply buy it. Piece by piece, farm by farm, they would turn the land into a commodity, and the people who lived on it would become pawns in a much larger game of economic domination. Emma and William spent the following days strategizing with the community's leaders. They needed to stay ahead of this new threat. The key would be organizing the valley's residents not just to resist, but to reframe the conversation around what the land truly meant to them. If the railroad and their investors were trying to turn the valley into something that could be bought and sold, then the farmers had to remind everyone what it was in its truest form, a living, breathing entity, one that had been sustained for generations by those who worked it, not those who viewed it as a resource to exploit. At the next community meeting, Emma took a different approach. She called not for a confrontation, but for a return to the core values that had held them together in the past: self-reliance, independence, and the interconnectedness of the land and the people who cultivated it. "We've already faced the threat of corporate control once, and we won," she said, standing before the crowd, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "But this time, the threat is different. It's not just about our farms, our irrigation, our crops. It's about the very idea of community. We must show the world that this valley isn't something that can be owned, divided, or controlled. It's something that is built on relationships between the land and the people who care for it." William spoke next, his voice steady but impassioned. "If we want to stop this new wave of development, we need to prove that we have something stronger than money, something more enduring. We have the knowledge, the skill, and the unity. We have the power to make sure this land stays ours, but we have to be smart. We have to build connections beyond these borders. We have to show the world what the valley means." A plan began to take shape. The farmers of Whispering Creek would start a cooperative, an alliance of farmers, ranchers, artisans, and small business owners that would give them the ability to resist the financialization of the land by pooling their resources. They would not just fight to keep the valley in their hands. They would prove that their way of life could thrive without the interference of outside interests. They would create a local economy based on sustainability, mutual aid, and community-driven development, one that could not be bought or sold by a man like Aldridge or Pierce. To do this, they would need to get creative. They reached out to sympathetic investors who believed in the power of local economies and sustainable farming practices. They sought out markets outside the valley, offering their goods as products of the land, a symbol of independence and resilience. They would not allow the railroad to dictate the terms of their future. The battle for Whispering Creek Valley had entered a new phase. It was no longer about courts or railroads. It was about redefining what success meant in a world that was increasingly defined by profit-driven agendas. Emma, William, and the community's leaders were prepared for a long fight. They understood that it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that they had something the corporate powers would never have: a deep, unbreakable connection to the land and to each other. And that, Emma realized, was something that no amount of money or legal authority could ever take from them. The cooperative quickly became the heart of their strategy. It wasn't just about pooling resources, it was about redefining their relationship with the land and the world. The farmers of Whispering Creek didn't just want to survive. They wanted to show the outside world that there was another way to live, one rooted in mutual respect, sustainable practices, and the enduring strength of community. At the center of the cooperative's work was a shared understanding. They weren't merely resisting corporate interests, they were creating a new model of economic development, one that prioritized people over profit. They would set the terms for their future. Slowly but surely, word began to spread, not just across the valley but beyond, as more and more small communities saw the model that Whispering Creek was building and took inspiration from it. Emma knew that if their experiment in self-sufficiency could succeed here, it could spark a larger movement, a resistance not just to the railroad or the financiers, but to the entire economic system that was threatening to overrun the American West. The initial steps were small but meaningful. Emma and William worked with local artisans to create a market for goods that were distinctly of the valley. Handcrafted furniture, textiles and tools made from the very wood and stone of the land itself. They connected with neighboring communities to offer their products, finding new channels of trade that bypassed the usual corporate middlemen. Slowly, the people of Whispering Creek began to realize that they had more to offer the world than just crops. They had a way of life that could be a model for others. The spirit of their resistance wasn't just about opposing the railroad or the land speculators. It was about creating an economy that didn't rely on exploitation. However, the corporate machine wasn't content to sit idly by. Pierce's allies, now backed by Aldridge's wealth and influence, started to apply more pressure. They flooded the local government with political contributions and set their sights on making sure the cooperative's growing influence didn't spread beyond the valley. They began to pull strings, manipulating the legal and political systems in ways that were subtle but effective. Local officials, once sympathetic to the farmers, found themselves under increasing pressure from state and federal levels. Even the cooperative's most trusted allies started to back off, frightened by the threats that came with standing too firmly against the tide of industry. Pierce, however, was growing increasingly desperate. Despite the money, the political ties, and the heavy hand of the law, the one thing he couldn't grasp was the sense of identity that the valley's residents shared. The farmers weren't fighting for land or resources. They were fighting for their way of life, and that was something that couldn't be bought or destroyed with money or power. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.